A simple midnight walk to de-stress turned into a nightmare when I realized that the silence of an abandoned neighborhood was being broken by screams that seemed to follow my every move. I am 26 years old and live in a townhome located in the far suburbs of a small city. My life generally follows a very repetitive and predictable pattern. I work closing shifts, usually finishing between 10:00 p.m. and 11:00 p.m., and spend the majority of my free time staying up late to game with my buddies online. A few months ago, however, a particularly stressful week at work left me feeling antisocial. I wasn't in the mood to hang out or even talk to my friends online, but I found myself unable to sleep. By 2:00 a.m., overwhelmed by boredom and restlessness, I decided to do something I rarely did: go for a late-night walk. I had always found night walks to be calming because nobody else was out, and it felt as though I had the entire town to myself. I grabbed a hoodie, locked up my place, and started walking without any specific plan of how far I would go. The area initially consisted of older, crowded houses that were not particularly special, but walking through them felt better than circling the townhomes. As I moved through the neighborhood, the peacefulness I was seeking seemed to settle in. Every house was dark and quiet, and there were no sounds at all, making it feel like the entire town was asleep. This isolation was exactly what I needed to de-stress after my long week. However, I eventually realized that I had been walking straight for a long time without making any turns, which had led me far to the outskirts of the town. The road abruptly thinned and led into a heavily wooded area where the houses were much further apart and hidden deep within the trees. The vibe changed instantly. It was darker, and the only light came from the occasional porch light or the dim street lights above the road. Despite the change in atmosphere, I was interested enough to keep going. I had traveled maybe half a mile into this wooded section when I suddenly heard a scream. It was a male voice, but it didn't sound like a cry for help. Rather, it sounded like a scream intended to get someone's attention. Because the area was so quiet, the voice echoed through the entire forest, making it difficult to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. I stopped and waited for about 30 seconds, looking for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. Thinking I would never be able to figure out what it was anyway, I decided to continue walking. As I progressed, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The streetlights became dimmer and further apart, and the houses I could see looked neglected, deteriorated, and possibly abandoned. They looked as though they weren't even lived in anymore. Even the road itself was getting more disheveled, as if no one used it. I knew this part of town struggled financially, but I hadn't realized this specific section existed. The realization that I was walking through a potentially abandoned neighborhood in the middle of the night made me extremely uncomfortable. Then I heard the scream again. It was almost the same as the last one, but it sounded closer, and I was almost certain it was from behind me. I stopped and turned around, staring into the road I had just traveled. Every little movement in the dark made me think there was someone out there. I knew I was getting paranoid and that it was best to leave. I didn't know how far the road continued or where it led, so I decided to go back the way I came. I turned back and began walking quickly, trying to get out of the wooded area as fast as possible. After a couple of minutes, I heard the scream again, but it was behind me, exactly where I had just come from. This meant that whoever was making the noise must have been hiding in the woods as I walked past them earlier. When I turned to look, I saw a man on the road wearing all black or dark clothes and walking toward me. I only looked for a second before turning and continuing to hurry down the road. Something about the situation didn't add up, and I had a feeling that if I stood there for too long, something really bad would happen. I turned to look several times after that, but despite seeing him walking toward me before, every other time I looked, he wasn't there. I wondered where he could have gone so quickly. Maybe he had turned around, not wanting to look like he was following me, but I didn't care to find out. I moved quickly until I finally made it out of that strange area and back to where the regular homes were. Even being back among the houses wasn't fully comforting, as I still felt the eerie sense of being alone, or perhaps the feeling that I wasn't alone. I eventually made it back to my townhouse. I wasn't sure if the walk had been the stress reliever I wanted, but I was just glad to be away from that creepy area and whoever was screaming out there. I went to the kitchen to get some water and a snack, then sat at the table for a minute to catch my breath. Just as I started to relax, I heard a shuffling sound outside my front door, followed by a sudden heavy knock. I instantly got up from the table and walked to the door as quietly as possible. I put my ear against it to listen, then looked out. I didn't have my porch light on, so it was pitch black outside, and all I could see was a dark figure standing there. After a few seconds, I was nearly positive it was the same guy from my walk. He had followed me home. The realization that the man from the woods had followed me all the way back to my townhouse turned my blood cold instantly. I stood frozen behind the heavy wood of my front door, listening to the oppressive silence of the night, realizing that the distance I had covered to escape him had meant absolutely nothing. I had no porch light on, so the view through the peephole was almost entirely pitch black, showing only the ominous and blurry silhouette of a dark figure standing perfectly still on my doorstep. My mind raced as I tried to understand how he had tracked me through the winding streets of the suburbs, without me seeing him again after that initial encounter on the road. The transition from the peaceful, de-stressing walk I had intended to this state of absolute vulnerability was jarring, and left me feeling trapped within my own walls. I backed away from the door as quietly as I possibly could, making sure my feet didn't scuff against the floor, and reached for my phone to call 911. I kept my voice as low as possible, almost a silent whisper, because I was terrified that the man outside would hear me and realize I was calling for help. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, giving them my address and explaining the situation with a shaking hand. Part of me actually wanted the man to stay right where he was until the police arrived because I was desperate for answers. I wanted to know who he was, why he was out in those woods, and what those strange screams were all about. While I was on the phone, the man began to knock. He struck the door 5 or 6 times with a heavy, deliberate force that seemed to echo through the entire downstairs area of my home. The sound was deeply disturbing, a blunt reminder that the safety of my locked door was the only thing standing between me and whatever he intended to do. Eventually, the knocking stopped and the area outside went quiet again. By the time the police officers arrived and began their investigation, the man had vanished into the darkness of the suburb. I explained everything to them in a rush. The stressful week at work, my decision to go for a 2:00 a.m. walk, the neglected and abandoned neighborhood I had stumbled upon, and the rhythmic, attention-grabbing screams I had heard echoing through the trees. The officers listened and admitted the entire situation was strange and unsettling, but since there was no physical damage to the property, and the intruder was no longer on the scene, they didn't dig any deeper into the incident. They took my statement and left, leaving me with a sense of dread that was even heavier than before. Their departure felt like a door being closed on my safety, as the official intervention provided no real resolution or peace of mind. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night, sitting in my living room and jumping at every small creak of the house or rustle of the wind against the windows. While I hoped that the sight of the police cars might have scared him off for good, the nightmare was actually just beginning. Over the course of the following month, a disturbing and persistent pattern began to emerge. I would be jolted out of a deep sleep in the middle of the night by sudden, heavy knocks at my front door. It was always the same distinctive, loud knocking I had heard that first night. Each time it happened, I would rush downstairs as fast as I could, my heart in my throat, trying to catch a glimpse of the person through the peephole before they could get away. However, the porch was always empty by the time I reached it. There was never anyone there, just the cold night air and the lingering, ghostly echo of the knock. This persistent harassment left me in a state of constant, grinding paranoia. I was unable to relax in my own home, finding myself checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day. Even during the daylight hours, I felt like I was being watched from the shadows. The freedom and peace I used to feel during my night walks were completely gone, replaced by the heavy knowledge that something had seen me that night in the woods and decided to keep coming back. It has been a while since the last visit, but the fear has never truly left me. I still don't know what was happening in those woods or what that man's ultimate goal was when he followed me home. I often think back to the screams and the way he moved through the dark with such silent, terrifying precision. My gut tells me that I came dangerously close to being part of something truly awful that night, and the fact that I never got any answers only makes the memory more haunting. I have stopped going for walks entirely, realizing that the silence of the night can hide things that are far more dangerous than the stress of a long work week. The town doesn't feel like mine anymore. It feels like a place where someone, or something, is still waiting for me to step back out into the dark. The silence that followed the man's disappearance from my front porch was not the peaceful quiet I had once enjoyed during my late-night walks. Even after the police officers concluded their brief questioning and left my property, the atmosphere inside my townhouse remained thick with a heavy, suffocating dread. I spent the remainder of that first night sitting upright, staring at the front door, paralyzed by the thought that he might still be standing just a few inches away on the other side of the wood. Every minor sound, the settling of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, or the wind brushing against the siding, made me jump, as my mind was now permanently primed to expect another heavy strike against the door. I felt a profound sense of violation, knowing that a total stranger had successfully tracked me from the dark outskirts of town directly to the place where I was supposed to be most secure. The weeks that followed were defined by a systematic erosion of my sense of safety and a growing feeling of isolation. Despite my best efforts to return to my normal routine of working closing shifts and gaming with my friends, the unsettling experience in the woods had fundamentally changed me. I found it impossible to focus on my games, often sitting in my headset in total silence, listening for sounds in my own house rather than the audio from the screen. My friends would ask why I was so quiet, but I didn't know how to explain that I was waiting for a knock that I knew was coming. The paranoia was most intense when I would arrive home from work late at night, a time when I used to feel most relaxed. Now, every shadow in the parking lot looked like the man in dark clothing, and the short walk from my car to my front door felt like a gauntlet of terror. I would fumble with my keys, my heart racing, convinced that he was watching me from the tree line just beyond the townhomes. My fears were validated by the fact that the knocking did not stop with that first night. Over the course of the next month, I was repeatedly jolted awake by loud, disturbing knocks at the front door in the dead of night. These weren't the accidental sounds of a neighbor or the wind hitting the glass. They were deliberate, aggressive blows that seemed specifically timed to ensure I never stayed asleep for long. Each time it happened, a cold jolt of adrenaline would surge through my body. I would scramble out of bed and rush to the door, my heart pounding so hard it was difficult to breathe. But by the time I looked through the peephole, the porch was always empty. There was never a trace of who had been there. No footsteps in the grass, no car driving away, just the lingering, haunting vibration of the knock itself. It felt like I was being haunted by a physical presence that had mastered the art of disappearing the moment it was challenged. I began to obsessively question the nature of the screams I had heard in that neglected, wooded neighborhood. I couldn't stop wondering if the man who followed me was the one screaming, or if he was hunting the person who was. The realization that he had tracked me nearly a mile from that abandoned area back to my specific townhome suggested a level of predatory persistence that went far beyond a chance encounter. I felt as though I had inadvertently stepped into a ritual or a private hunting ground that I was never meant to see. The police had dismissed the screams as strange but ultimately unimportant, yet to me, they felt like the beginning of a story that ended with a man standing silently at my door. I spent hours staring at maps of the outskirts, trying to understand where that road went, but it only led to more questions and a deeper sense of unease about what lay hidden just outside the city limits. Eventually, the visit stopped, and the knocking faded into memory, but the psychological scars remained. It has been a long time since his last visit, but I still feel a bit paranoid every time the sun goes down. I have since found it impossible to go for walks at night, a hobby that used to be my primary way to de-stress after a long week. The dark town no longer feels like it belongs to me. It feels like a vast, unmonitored space where people can hide in the woods and scream into the void without consequence. I still find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times before I can even attempt to sleep, and I have installed motion sensor lights that illuminate the entire front of my house at the slightest movement. In my gut, I know that I was very close to being part of something really awful that night. The lack of answers is perhaps the most difficult part to live with. I will never know what that man wanted or why he chose to follow me specifically. Was he trying to scare me away from something I wasn't supposed to see, or was he inviting me back into the dark? I am left with only the certainty that some parts of the suburbs are better left unexplored, and that some screams aren't cries for help, but signals of a danger that most people are lucky enough to never encounter. I live my life with a new, permanent caution, always aware that just beyond the well-lit streets of my neighborhood lies a darkness that is far more active than it appears. Every time I hear a distant sound at night, I wonder if he's finally decided to come back and finish what he started.